Well, good morning to you this morning. Great to see you, and we're glad you're here at Stones Hill Community Church. I'm Pastor Joey, and it's a privilege to welcome you here each week. We are currently in a series called The Story. It's finding your story and God's story, and chances are, wherever your story has taken you, God has already been there. And so I don't know where your story may have taken you here this morning, but it's certainly great to see you here. And if God's story can intersect with your story here this morning, then so be it. That's our trust and our prayer. So we are in chapter 18, it's called. There's a 31-chapter series that we're in. Some of you have the book called The Story, and you're tracking with me through this series. I'm reminded of what C.H. Spurgeon said of Daniel. He said, it's probably a good thing the lions did not eat him or try to eat him because he was about 50% gristle and 50% backbone, and they wouldn't have enjoyed him if they had tried. Sometimes we need gristle, whatever that is, and backbone to make it, especially in whatever circumstances we may find ourselves in life. For Daniel, he was in exile. You've heard me talk a little bit about this. How that the people of Israel in 722 BC, the northern kingdom of Israel went into captivity via the Assyrian Empire, and then about 150 some odd years later, the southern kingdom of Israel, known as the nation of Judah, went into captivity. And it was under the Babylonian rule that they did so. So we're in a chapter 18, Daniel in Exile is the name of it. You'll see that title on your bulletin. And if we look on slide number 3, guys, slide number 3, we're going to be looking at, in the book of Daniel, chapter 6, verses 1 through 10, verses 16 through 23. If you happen to have brought your book called The Story today, you'll find chapter 18 on pages 249 through 259. And if you'd like to discuss the message today or some of the details involved with the story, there are discussion groups and things that you can be a part of to do that. I would encourage you to do that. Last week we talked a little bit about the Babylonians and how they endeavored to conquer the world. Of course, they took exiles in 605 BC, but it wasn't until 586 BC that the nation of the Judah and Jerusalem actually fell. In 586 BC, though, that was the fall of Jerusalem. But before that, they began the deportation process. And the way the Babylonians would do it, they wanted the elite, the bright, young, intellectual minds of the people that they conquered, and they were going to move them deport them into their nation there in Babylon and begin to enculturate them into the ways of the Babylonian world. The Babylonians were smart people. They tried expulsion. They would drive people from their land, and then as they conquered the world, and then ultimately they would return. So that didn't work. They tried subjugation. We'll push them down. We'll enslave them and see if that works. And but that didn't work. Inevitably, there's some rogue warrior who decides to mount a revolt. People follow him, and there's problems. And so the Babylonians decided that wasn't the best policy. And the third thing that they've tried here and that seemed to work was assimilation. We can't expel you. We can't subjugate you for very long. We've tried it and it's not been successful. What we're going to do is we're going to assimilate you. We'll take the intellectually, mentally talented captives and we'll give you a good job. We'll let you buy property in our nation. We'll let you blend in and become one of us. Just don't rock the boat too much, okay? And we'll assimilate you. And before long, you will forget about who you are. You'll forget about where you used to live, and you'll forget about what story you used to tell. You'll forget about what story identifies you and that tells you where you're headed in life, where you've come from, what went wrong in the world, what God's doing to fix it, what your role is in the process. You'll forget the answers to those questions, because you will have become fully one of us. You'll be a Babylonian. Augustine said, and I mentioned it last week, there's two great cities in the world. There's the city of Babylon. It represents the pride of man. It represents doing life our way. And then there's the city of Jerusalem. And these two cities clash. And you see this in the Bible. The city of Jerusalem is the city where God is represented, where we selflessly and sacrificially pour out our lives. Okay? And we have these two cities. And in every literal city in the world, there's a mini city within it. And it's a Jerusalem. Those who represent the city of Jerusalem. Those who represent a different kind of life, a different kind of culture, a different kind of value system. And so these cities clash. And St. Augustine wrote about that and talked about that a lot. And so here we have Daniel, who's trying to show us how to live as citizens of our true King, as citizens of a true city, the city of Jerusalem, the city of God, according to God's plan and worldview and principles for life in the world. How can we live according to His values, even though we are nested in the Babylonian culture of the world? And this is his great challenge. And what we see here is Daniel and his three buddies. They do a great job of representing God, and they continue to represent God well in their culture. They certainly are a part of their culture. They make things better. They do great work, and you're going to see that in Daniel's life here today as we work our way through this. And so they definitely represent God, but they also understand that they are called to extend His influence in the world and to be the storytellers of the great story that God is telling in the Bible and in the world. Well, eventually, the Medo-Persian Empire, slide number 8 if you would, slide number 8, the Medo-Persian Empire gets big and they begin to expand, and what happens is the nation of Babylon is conquered. And so the Medo-Persians employ Daniel, who used to be now a Babylonian ruler. They employ him to actually help rule the kingdom of the Medo-Persians. And so Daniel is living through an empire change. And Daniel refuses to pray to Darius, and you're going to see the details of this in Daniel 6 in just a second. This was the king who conquered the Babylonians, and so he's thrown into a pit of lions, and it's known as Daniel in the lion's den. Darius' officials are jealous of Daniel, as the video showed to you, and the plot to trap him by convincing Darius to have all the people pray to Darius for 30 days. That's kind of how this thing develops. And Daniel is in a habit, though, of opening his window, and 3 times a day, and he prays. He faces toward Jerusalem, toward the west, where he's at. He's in the east. He faces toward the west, and he prays that someday God would bring him and his people back home again. That God would keep His promise that He made through Jeremiah the prophet, that after 70 years they could go home. And he prayed this, and he believed God for this. And this was the story that was going to give him his sense of identity for his life, not only in Babylon, but in the days to come. And so if we go to slide 4, we'll just pick up the story. And you've maybe read this story and heard about this story in Sunday school, or if you didn't go to church, or maybe you don't have a church background, maybe this is new to you. But it's a very intriguing story. And it's a very powerful story of how God intervenes. But it also has a heavy dose of reality, I think, nested in the story. And what we see is not just that if we serve God, we get to escape from the lion's dens of life without a scratch. I think that's a surface moral. We try to get a moral from a story. That's what we kind of tend to do with this story. But it's so much more than that. It's not just that, okay, I'll honor God and He'll deliver me miraculously if I'm good and I trust Him, and I'll get to do life without a scratch. Well, it's a good moral, and praise God for His interventions in these very difficult places in our lives. But it's bigger than that. And I think that we even see it hinted at in the animal kingdom. And especially the lions and the ferociousness of the lions, and how that in the Bible that something is being represented in the animal kingdom. Something in the animal kingdom mirrors what is going on in cosmic and unseen places in the world. And that sometimes the spiritual breaks out into the physical, and this cosmic opposition to God and the story that's being told, it breaks out in stories like this. And so there's a cosmic story, there's a bigger story playing out than just Daniel in the lion's den. But it's an incredible story. And so what we see in Daniel is that the spiritual realm gives way to a physical manifestation. Here's a physical battle that's playing out right here in the story, but it depicts something major happening in spiritual places. I think you'll see it as we kind of work our way through this. And so Daniel chapter 6, verse 1, it pleased Darius, and the word Darius is really a title. It's kind of like saying Pharaoh or king or Caesar. It's a title. And so we find the word Darius used on inscriptions in archaeology. There's at least 5 different Persian rulers that are all called Darius. And so it's like a title. It's a description. It pleased Darius, slide number 4, it pleased Darius, the king, the leader, to appoint 120 satraps or princesses or protectors of the kingdom to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. And he's like 80 years old by this time in the story. He's been 40 years administrative. He has 40 years of administrative experience. And so remember, if you are this old, you still have a lot to offer. So glorify God with your life. He will use your life. So glorify Him. And so Daniel was definitely going to glorify God. You know, I've shared with you before, and I've shared in classes recently that I've taught with others and things, and in conversations. One of the ways I think that we hear people talk about glorifying God and honoring God, and what does that mean to glorify God? What does it mean? I think a good practical definition is to when it comes to glorifying God, is that someone's opinion of God changes for the better because of you. And think about that. Someone's opinion of God changes for the better because of you. And that's what Daniel was about in his life. Someone's opinion of God changes for the better because of his life. And that's the manner in which he lived his life. The satraps were made accountable to them, and so Daniel was one of the 3 main administrators, and the satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Verse 3, now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. See, he glorified God with his life. He made God look better because of the way he lived his life. That's what it means to glorify God. He had a great leadership profile. You can look at Daniel's story. He had insight into people's lives. He had integrity. He didn't have any interest in bribery or paying payoffs in his high governmental position. He had credibility from years of serving and living well. He was humble. He was competent. He was courageous with a great attitude, and he made everybody's job easier because he knew how to lead. And if you want to know how to lead, you got to definitely have some backbone and gristle, okay? But you got to have these other things in your life. And Daniel was an incredible leader, and that's why he was retained by the new Medo-Persian Empire. Even though the Babylons were conquered, that's why he was retained as an administrator and a leader, because the new king, even saw something in him, that he stood out from everybody else. And he's getting promoted, but other people don't like it. You see, he's a Jewish exile. He's a senior citizen by this time. He's a non-Babylonian, Median, and he's outdoing us, and we don't like it. And so they see this. And so verse 4, at this the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. No matter how closely they tailed him, no matter how many conversations they eavesdropped on, no matter how many letters they fished out of the trash, this guy was clean in his business dealings. He was clean in his bank accounts. He was clean in his closed-door meetings. He lived a life of integrity, and he shows us how to do that. They could not find corruption in him, verse 4 says, because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. And wouldn't it be awesome? And perhaps one of the greatest ways we live in our world one of the biggest impacts that we can make is to live our lives such that there's no charges that can stick. That we live lives of integrity. And that we live lives of faithfulness. That we live lives that honor God. Verse 5, finally these men said, we will never find any basis for charges against this man, Daniel, unless it has something to do with the law of his God. We will never find any basis for charges against this man. Wouldn't it be great if these were words spoken over all of our lives? We will never find any basis for charges against this man or woman. Slide 5, verse 6. So these administrators and satraps went out as a group, and they had aligned themselves on this, and they're going to present this proposal to the king with the sense that it has overwhelming support. And so to the king, and they said, may King Darius live forever. It's a customary greeting. Verse 7, the royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Slide number 9. The lion's den. These guys were purposely starved to be used as executioners on slide number 9. And where someone would be torn to pieces and devoured. And I don't know how many there were, but it must have been an awful lot of them. Because when you get to the end of the chapter, like we're going to do in just a second, everything starts coming down on the heads of the people who made this plot. And they throw all of them in there, and they throw it even in their families, because that was the law of the Medes and the Persians. And they get eaten up before they hit the ground. It's crazy how this thing transpires. So there's a lot of lions in there, and they're hungry. It wasn't just these toothless lions with no appetite that Daniel was spent the night with, okay? These were ferocious creatures. And they were capable of doing a lot of crazy things. All right? And so, evidently they had some kind of a top entrance, and they could hoist the people and food and other things down through this top entrance, and then they could seal it up. And that's kind of what they end up doing here in Daniel's case. So on slide number 5, verse 8, now your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. Verse 9. So King Darius put the decree in writing, and now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. And he was loyal still. He was a loyal citizen to a kingdom you couldn't see, even though he was living in Babylon. 3 times a day, Daniel got down on his knees and he prayed, giving thanks to his God just as he had done before. He wanted to please God more than Darius. And so it's civil disobedience, and Daniel would trust God to rescue him. If arrested, he's going to do what he's always done. And verse 16, slide number 6. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve, continually rescue you. In other words, I like you, Daniel. I can't believe I got suckered into this, but I'm going to trust that your God can deliver you from this. And a stone, verse 17, a stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. And Daniel was in the den, and we're kind of waiting anxiously what's going to happen to him. And like they do even in the movies, the writer cuts, in verse 18, he cuts away from the den to the king's palace. And so we have to wait a little more here, another couple of verses, before we find out what happens. Verse 18, then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. Have you ever had a night like that, where you toss and you turn and you can't sleep? Maybe God is trying to tell you something. Maybe God is trying to communicate with you. It's interesting because in literature, generally the sleepless night is usually like an archetype of the guilty or the conscience or the soul in turmoil. And in the Bible too, people who have these sleepless nights usually have good reason for their unsettled experience. And many of the sleepless nights in the Bible belong to pagan kings. It's kind of interesting when you kind of run a study on that. But have you had trouble sleeping lately? maybe something going down that you feel like shouldn't be going down, and you're tossing and you're turning, you don't know what to do. Well, that's the king. Verse 19, at the first light of dawn, the king got up and he hurried to the lion's den. Evidently, if you survive one night in the lion's den, then you deserve, and you're not destroyed, you deserve to be released. And the king kind of understood that. On slide 7, verse 20, when he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions? And Daniel answered, may the king live forever. And I'm sure there's probably a dramatic pause in there. How long did he wait before he said, may the king live forever? I don't know. But he asked this question, just kind of hangs there. And then from the pit of the lion's den, the bottom of this pit, may the king live forever. More wonderful words were never heard by the king. Verse 22, my God sent His angel, a pre-incarnate Christ perhaps. My God sent His angel, and He shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in His sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, Your Majesty. Verse 23, the king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found in him, because he had trusted in God. And verse 24 says, at the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. It's a kind of a sobering way to wrap up an intriguing story. And like I was saying, some will look at this story of Daniel in the lion's den, and it's exciting, it's intriguing. It's like, wow, God shows up in just the right moment. And He's with Daniel, and that's awesome. And so the kind of the moral of the story is, if you're good and you trust God, God will take care of you too. So be courageous, because God will take care of you, and that's the moral of the story. And if that's what this story is here for, and if this is why the writer put this story in the Bible, so you would know if you were innocent and you were good and you trusted God, that you would never get a scratch in life. No wonder a lot of people don't believe in the story today. It's no wonder that some choose not to be a citizen of the kingdom of God, because that's not Christianity. It's not the life and message of Jesus either, because we all know Christian people who didn't come out of the lion's den unscratched. And it's not the message of the citizens of Jerusalem that we get to go through life without a scratch. It's not the message. In fact, we get scratches in life. There are tough places, and it's indicative of sometimes there's a cosmic battle playing out, and sometimes it breaks out, and it's disguised in the form of jealousy, and it's disguised in the form of betrayals, and it's disguised in the form of individuals who get together to concoct a scheme to defeat the work of God and His story in the world. You see, there's a cosmic battle playing out. It's more than just about getting through life without a scratch. This cosmic battle, and we see in the book of Psalms, Psalm 7 and Psalm 10 and Psalm 57, and over and over and over again, roaring lions is a symbol of the disharmony of nature and the sufferings and the danger of life. It's almost like it reminds me of the poet who said that nature is red in tooth and claw, the poet said. I'm reminded when I read that and I see that observation, and I see the ferociousness of the lions, and we've all have seen, we wonder why do we live in a world where animals like to eat each other? Why do we live with so much violence in the world? And I'm reminded of what Bob Chisholm shared. He said that as a boy, he learned a lot from watching animals. He says that when he was a teenager, he had a dog named Mickey. And Mickey was part German Shepherd and part Beagle. And he liked to hunt woodchucks in the fields behind his house. And of course, woodchucks are cautious, and they have 2 holes several feet apart. And so they usually graze and feed and things between the two holes. And so if danger shows up, they're able to hightail it to one of their nearby holes and jump in and have a place of safety. And so they're very cautious. And he said Mickey, his dog, was a great hunter, though, because he would try to always begin downwind from the woodchucks, and so that they couldn't pick up his scent. And he would circle around the woodchuck to start hunting in just the right spot. And he would lie in the deep grass for several minutes waiting for the woodchuck to appear, and he graze its way to a point halfway between its two holes. And then Mickey would move forward as if in slow motion. And he would keep as low as possible, and if the woodchuck looked up, Mickey froze. He just waited for his opportunity. And when the distance was right, he would spring into action like a rocket, and it was a mad dash to see if he could reach the woodchuck before it reached its hole. And Chisholm talks about how he used to watch this from a distance, and how all the things that he learned about life just by watching his dog do battle with the woodchucks, and how he learned about foresight and caution, and lessons about strategy and patience and timing from his dog Mickey. But he said, there was an emotionally disturbing dark side to being a student in this school of nature, he says. And he was just a young boy. He said most of the time, Mickey, he was an avid hunter like this, and most of the time the woodchucks would escape. But he said sometimes Mickey would win. And he said, I had to watch the violent, brutal death of Mickey's victim. He says, it was obvious that Mickey was created with a killer instinct and a fine-tuned ability to hunt. But he said, it raised a haunting question in my mind. Why did God make dogs natural-born killers? Why did He make some animals so helpless, some animals so strong and ferocious, like lions? Other animals so helpless, so easily killed, eaten by the dogs or lions or other things. And this presented a crisis for Bob Chisholm as he tried to figure out why the world was set up the way it was. Why the world, in the words of the poet, why nature is red in tooth and claw. And maybe you've wondered about that. Maybe you've wondered why life has to be the way it is. I think about Robert Alter, who states, in the animal kingdom, the tender care for one's young may well mean they're gulping the blood of freshly slain creatures. Well, I think God has given us some insight into this picture we see in the animal kingdom, that somehow there's a cosmic battle going on, and God sets things up in such a way that we see in the physical realm, we see insight into what's happening in the spiritual realm. It seems that God has given us some insight into this reality, into this brutal, violent world at times. And He's given us assurance that the world as we know it will be transformed. We read in Romans 8:19-22, Paul writes, for the creation awaits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. And we know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. And so we discover that God subjected the creation to frustration and the bondage of decay. And so it seems to be hinted at in Genesis 1 in the creation account, in the opening chapters of the story. It's like the primordial deep and darkness are not eliminated as God creates and He orders the world as we currently know it. And instead of eliminating the darkness, instead of eliminating things like the ferociousness of animals and the violence that goes on in the natural world, they are integrated into the created order by a sovereign God. And even though this order is pronounced good in Genesis 1, it is not ideal. It's good, but it's not ideal. For in the new creation seen by John later in the book of Revelation, what does get eliminated? It's darkness and the sea. And the very elements of the created order that remind us there is cosmic opposition to God. Psalm 74, Psalm 89, it tells us that God had to overcome a very proud and fearsome enemy just to create the world. And Satan was in charge of this region known as earth. And it has been delegated to him, but he made a mess of it and he rebelled. And Paul in Ephesians 6 reminds us that this war with the powers of darkness continues on. And we're caught up in the midst of this conflict. And it's mirrored by the natural world, including the animal kingdom. That God gives us a picture in the animal world, what is happening in the spiritual world. So God permits in the animal kingdom today what I see as a living illustration of what always happens in the spiritual realm. That there are people in a battle. And it's not just the random decisions of men making decisions and one nation rising and one nation falling. It's not just a random occurrence of events with a God that is out of control who looks over the window sill of heaven and He wrings His hands as if He doesn't know what He's doing. No, there's a larger conflict playing out in the world. And when that conflict is taking place, God has set it up such that this conflict is being mirrored in the animal world, in the natural world in which we live, such that we would never miss it. And when that conflict gets resolved by God's victory, the resolution will be mirrored in creation as well. And that's why one of my favorite passages, like Isaiah 7, it pictures for us what that world will be like. A king will come, a new David, energized by the Spirit of the Lord. He will be a just king over a new Jerusalem. And Isaiah 11, 6-9 says, the wolf will live with the lamb. See, when God overcomes in this cosmic battle of the ages, when evil has been conquered and defeated, and a new Jerusalem breaks out in a visible form in our world, and one age swallows another age, the wolf will live with the lamb, the leper will lie down with the goat, the calf and the lion and the yearling together, and a little child will lead them, the cow will feed with the bear, their young will lie down together, and the lion will eat straw like the ox. The infant will play near the cobra's den. The young child will put its hand in the viper's nest. They will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain. For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And so Isaiah 7 says someday that God is going to wipe this place clean. And the universe will be restored. And Babylon will cease to exist. And there will be nothing but harmony. There will be nothing but peace in a new Jerusalem. Our bodies will work right. And the nature will work right. And there won't be disease and there won't be death. And finally, in the created order, it will mirror what God has done and will be doing in the spiritual realm. And so, those of you who have struggled, and maybe you've got a tender heart, and you see the animal kingdom and some of the battles that take place, you see lions that devour, if not people, they devour other animals. Okay? And stories like this teach us so much more than just getting through life without a scratch. It teaches us that in all the ugliness and the crappiness of life, that there is a God who is working in cosmic places, and we see this battle break out in the physical, literal realm from time to time. And it's to serve as a reminder that someday it gets cleaned up. Someday it gets made right. And you and I can live in light of this great story of the ages, because we know that what we see in Daniel in the lion's den is just a foretaste of what and I think that Christ is a pre-incarnate Christ here. I think Christ is with Daniel in the lion's den before He's incarnated later in the gospel accounts. And I think what Jesus does there with Daniel in the den and holding back the curse and the darkness, and what happens typically in the animal realm, it's a foretaste of what He's going to do someday He's going to step into this world. He's going to step into all of this massive confusion and this world of violence and evil and bloodshed in tooth and claw. And He's going to clean it up. And He's going to say, now, this is what I've come to do. This is what I've created you for. And that's what we see in Daniel. So it's much more than just getting through life without a scratch. It's much more than that. It's a God who not only has given us a reminder of how this battle rages in the spiritual realms, He gives us the hope that someday the mouths of lions will be shut and righteousness will prevail. And so Daniel and the lion's den means so much more to me this morning than getting through life without a scratch. It ultimately means the end of cosmic conflict, that someday it gets resolved. And so it means the transformation of nature, red in tooth and claw, as the poet says. It gets cleansed of its blood stains, and ironically it gets cleansed by the blood of one that Isaiah later depicts in his prophecies as a suffering servant who sheds his blood such that we can know peace and we can know joy and we can have hope that someday it gets resolved. One time I came home from a walk, and you have to understand, my daughter Megan has a very tender heart. A very tender heart. You know, oh, there's a gnat. What? Don't step on it. You know, it's that kind of tender heart, you know. And we've been walking before, and out of the blue, she'll just, like, you know, yell something out. You know, there's a caterpillar or something, and we're all, you know, deathly frozen because is Megan getting attacked? Is she getting bitten? Is there a snake? You know, what's going on? It's just probably maybe a little insect that she sees that she doesn't want to hurt. And she has a very tender heart. It's always been that way. And we come home from a walk one time, and our dog, Reggie, has taken on a groundhog head to head. Now you have to understand, I'm from West Virginia. I cheer these battles. Okay? I thrive in these battles. And it's like, yes, the spiritual cosmic battle breaking out, and I get a ringside seat. Okay? But not Megan. It doesn't work that way for her. And she sees this dog grab this groundhog. And you know, it shakes this thing. To know, I mean, just really shakes this thing, attacks this thing. And she's sitting there, this girl who won't bother a gnat or step on a worm or destroy an ant. Okay, she's watching this thing unfold in all of its violence and fury. And then I go, she comes to me crying, and Reggie, I guess, senses it because he goes to the doghouse and he hides and he won't come out. So somehow these red and tooth and claw animals have a conscience somehow. I don't know how, but they do sometimes. He did anyway. Well, and you know, we have to understand, you know, we live in this world and it is fallen, and there's some crazy stuff that happens. And you know, God has called us to be stewards, and it's awesome, and we've got to, you know, there's a certain amount of death in the animal world. I mean, you know, that's the beauty of hunting, and it's awesome to hunt, and I just applaud you hunters who are really good at bringing home the dinner for the winter and things like that. That's awesome, and that's cool, and you keep up the good work. That's exciting. Like I said, I'm from West Virginia. I'm all for that. Okay, they've got basically they got 4 seasons in West Virginia. You got deer season, squirrel season, you know, and all the other, you know, turkey season. That's the seasons. Okay, good West Virginians understand that. All right, so I'm all down with that. That's awesome, and that's really cool. And I was hunted before in my life and fished and things, and that was a big part of my life. And it probably still is. There's still some of those longings in there. But see, there's coming a time. And I'm still intrigued by the animal world, I guess. And not long ago, I watched this 2,000-mile stampede of wildebeest that are trying to make a journey through the African wilderness. And it seems like the daggone predators always pick on the little cute ones. Do you know what I mean? They always pick on the little babies. And you watch these lions attack these little babies. They separate it from the herd so the mommy and the daddy can't do anything about it. And every now and then I like it when daddy looks and mommy looks and they say, uh-oh, they got our little one. This is not happening. And here they come with the horns, and they'll take those lions, grab them on their horns, and those lions will be flipping up in the air. It's like, yeah, go for it. A little payback, right? We cheer that. But I watched this and how that, and I couldn't figure out why I was depressed after I watched this documentary. Okay? I was like, I'm in West Virginia. This stuff doesn't bother me. I used to be able to skin a buck. I don't know if I can now, but used to be able to. Okay? I've seen this stuff. I've watched my dad skin squirrels and tried to teach me how. All right? I know this world. Why is this documentary bothering me? Well, then it goes theological. Because I know there's a roaring lion. And he picks off the little ones. He isolates them from the herd. And I see mirrored in the animal world what great cosmic battle of the ages playing out. And it breaks out in the animal kingdom. God gives us a visual tool to see this spiritual warfare happening all around us. And then I realized why I got so depressed. Because I saw something. And maybe that's your story. Maybe you've been isolated and cut off from the support systems of your life, and maybe you've made some choices and decisions, and maybe you've decided you're going to go with Babylon on some values and things, and boy, it's really come back to mess your life up. I just see those little baby wildebeest trying to survive, and they come to the water and they try to get across the water, and these huge alligators about 20 feet long grab these things, and they're swimming hard. They're hard. Come on, I got to get. And the moms and dads just watch these things. And then finally that baby just goes down. It doesn't come up again. Why did that bother me? It mirrors something. And I couldn't figure out why I was depressed for a couple of days, but finally I got it. Studying this passage, seeing what God's trying to say to us. He made a good creation. It wasn't ideal, but it was good. He left us. He subjects the creation in such a way that we understand there's a major deal going down every day in the spiritual realm. And so the question I got for you this morning is, if you think that getting through life without a scratch is the goal of this story, I think you've missed Daniel. I think you've missed him. And the story of Daniel in the lion's den. But but on the other hand, if you see this as a God who eventually checks the fallenness of our world and the violence and the bloodshed of our world, He eventually checks it. Then I think you're seeing something bigger. And if you see it, that sometimes there are people who get devoured in this great cosmic struggle. And that how much as a pastor, I don't want to see you get devoured like those little guys trying to survive in a river in Africa with a 20-foot alligator tugging down your baby. Sometimes that's the way a pastor feels. And I'm not going to promise you you're going to get through life unscathed and without a scratch. And there's a cosmic battle raging, and sometimes there are shrapnel, there are wounds that we take on from the shrapnel, the explosions in the battle. But this morning, what I want for you more than anything is that you would come to the Creator God, and you would serve Daniel's God. And you would have 50% backbone and 50% gristle. Because that's what it's going to take in the days ahead. Federal government is definitely not going to espouse the biblical worldview and Christian values. It's going to become more antagonistic to be a Christ follower and you never think it, but maybe even praying a prayer in a public place, opening your window and facing Jerusalem, praying 3 times, that became illegal. It became illegal. And as we think about the days ahead, it's now becoming illegal to insist that someone conform to the gender on their birth certificate. Think about how illogical that is. It's illegal to be logical. This is where, I've told you so many times, this is where it wants to go. You're not going to get through this thing called life without a scratch. But you serve God. You stay principled. You serve God. You honor God. And yes, He may in fact deliver you from the mouths of lions, like Hebrews 11:33 says. But immediately after those words in Hebrews 11, we read about those who were tortured and refused to be released, and they faced jeers and flogging, and they were stoned, and they were sawn in two, and they were put to death by the sword. There was no shutting of lions' mouths in their cases. They bit the bullet to say, I'm going with Christ. You see, God calls some to win by living. Others are called to win by dying. But in life or death, God rules, and we are called to serve Him. And the question is, will we do it? And Daniel chooses the lion pit rather than apostasy. And the world needs those who know God and who will live for His righteousness, even when the entire culture turns ferociously against it. And I would just say what happened in ancient Babylon and Persia will eventually happen yet again. And it will be made illegal to hold biblical values publicly. And the question is, what will you do then? What makes a man or woman have an impact that is as far-reaching as an empire? What is it in Daniel? He knew his God. He glorified God. I'm going to honor God with my life, in my job, where I live, how I raise my family, what the things I do in the world, the acts of service maybe that I do. I'm going to help people view of God change for the better because of my life. That's what it means. And so as we live in exile, as the Babylonian values of the world increase, as things get more antagonistic, as we see mirrored even in the animal kingdom for us what's happening in the spiritual world, the call is issued forth this morning to dare to be a Daniel. You know, I was preparing, I'll close with this. I was preparing actually a couple of funeral messages this week. And I've just been digging through all this stuff I just shared with you this morning. Just digging through how the animal kingdom mirrors what's the spiritual kingdom and the cosmic battle in the cosmic spiritual places, you know. And then I walked through this service, the funeral service for Margaret Leslie, 94 years old. And when she lived in Kimmel back in 1921, was born, there were still Indian tribes that lived in the woods behind her house. That's how long ago this lady lived, and then she accidentally took a picture, a selfie. So imagine that. Indian tribes all the way to selfie. That's where we've come. It's a long way. But I was preparing that message or preparing the funeral service with the family, and they said, you know, there's a song that we want played. And I've just been studying this, you know, I've been thinking about this documentary, you know, these poor little wildebeest trying to make the safari, you know, the journey, the 2,000-mile journey. I'm just seeing vivid pictures of these guys going down. I see the attacks of the lions and things. I'm thinking about this passage. I'm thinking about just the spiritual warfare that's going on. I'm thinking about all this stuff, you know, and what's going on in the current day. And my mind's going just top speed. And they said, we'd like to have that one song played. I think it's called "His Eye is on the Sparrow." And I know He watches me. And it touched me. His eye is on the sparrow. Yeah, it's a rough world. We don't get out of it unscratched. But there's a God, and He sees people like Daniel who say, I'm going to honor my God. I'm going to glorify Him I don't care what the circumstances may be. I'm going to stand for Him. And maybe this morning you need to hear this song. I know I needed to hear it. Guys, why don't you play it? Let's just sit quietly for a moment, and this will be our closing, okay? His eyes on the sparrow, and I know He watches me. Father, we're reminded this morning that we are not alone in the battle, that You are a great God. You have made a beautiful world, and this world has fallen from its original design. We understand that. But also we're reminded every day that there's a great cosmic battle playing out, and it's playing out for the lives of people. And I just ask and pray here this morning that You would be with our congregation, but be with the people who are here today, trying to make their journey, trying to understand the story of God, and trying to orient their story toward Your story. And there are some here this morning that perhaps a little isolated from the herd. Some maybe this morning that the ferociousness of the lions, the roar of the lion, seeking whom he may devour, Peter writes about that. Maybe they've heard the roar of the lion and they're afraid. And I just ask and pray that they would turn their face towards You this moment and Your strength, and that they would dare to be a Daniel who trust in their God, turn to their God, look to their God, no matter what the cost. And so it is this morning that we pray for this congregation, and you would guide them. You would guide the people of our church family, and You would guide those that are here today that maybe they've struggled with these crises of faith, like Bob Chisholm had, watching this battle play out in his backyard. Maybe they've had other crises of faith here this morning, and maybe they've grappled with issues, and maybe they've gotten sidetracked on some of these things. I just ask and pray here this morning that each of them would find in You the everlasting Lord, who is writing a story that eventually resolves these issues, and eventually resolves the issues of our heart and our life. So You be with us this morning. You help us to go now in Your hope and Your strength. And we just raise up the power of God on behalf of these people. The alligators can't have them. The enemy cannot have them. The lions cannot have them. We band together and we pray a hedge around them. And You would keep them safe. And You would keep us safe, all of us safe. But that we would also be willing to maintain a sense of strong conviction in faithfulness to our God and loving Him and honoring Him, even when it is antagonistic to do so. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you. You've been a great group. Would you stand with me this morning? I'll let you go, and if you'd like to pray or talk with someone, just come ahead. We've got a couple prayer team guys that's going to come out. You have a great day, okay? Blessings.